Hi, I'm Jon Atack, and yet again, I'm delighted to welcome Karen De La Carriere. Hi, Karen.
Jon, come here and get a hug. Hi, Jon. Good to see you. Good to see you.
Yeah, always a pleasure.
Hope you had a good Christmas.
I did.
All good wishes. You did?
Yeah.
Nice.
I got to see all 4 of my children and my grandchild, so that's the main thing, you know.
Oh.
Family.
Family. Yeah. Yep. You got great boys, huh? Great sons.
Yeah, I have 3 sons and a daughter, and you know, I'm very pleased because they all still like me. They all smile when I come in the room still, so that's all right. That's good.
Nice. Yeah.
So here we are, and you've sent me a few bullet points for us to talk about, and I think we start with the notion of authority and the supposedly charismatic leader, which is something I would like your opinion about, Ron Hubbard, on, you know, that this idea of him being charismatic and what that means. You know, that when I've now talked to many people who spent time with him, and it seems to me to be rather fake, the charisma, you know, that it was something that he switched on and switched off. He wasn't a genuinely lovely human being that everybody loved. You know, he was a bloke with rotten teeth who shouted a lot, which is not quite the same thing. So what was your experience of him in those terms, his compassion, his charisma?
Yeah. First of all, in the years I was on the Apollo, he was treated like a god. Just, there was so much altitude for him. If somebody had a 5-minute little interlude talking to him, they would run down, because he was on promenade deck, we should come down and say, oh my God, I just had 5 minutes with the Commodore and I'm floating on clouds.
Wow.
And people were, wow, you got with him for 5 minutes, you talked. So he did have huge meltdowns of rage. He would even scream at Mary Sue. He did.
Yeah.
And my counseling room was exactly behind a partition of his research room. This was his research room, and my auditing room was neck to neck behind it. And every time I came out, his office was all glass, see-through. So as I walked down the promenade deck, I would always look to see if he was at his desk. You know, he would be all folders, paperwork. He'd have his naval cap on, which hid this big lump. He wore a naval cap to hide a bulbous
cyst.
Yeah. And you know, I thought the world of him when I was there. I thought he was just a genius. I watched him carefully, and I thought his way of evolving questions to, I thought he was great. I was truly sucked in. Now, I didn't see the outpoint of his bellowing and screaming.
Yeah.
I didn't see that. How is that a leader of a New Age religion? I didn't connect the dots. The mindset when he screamed and carried on was, people are really screwing up. They're making him mad. What are they doing to make him so mad? It was an immediate thought of that. Did I tell you? I told you the little story of how he ordered one of his messengers to throw a shoe at his own daughter. Did I tell you that story?
You did, yes. That was Diana. Yeah.
Yeah. It was so more and more he leaned. Ken Urquhart, I got to hand it to you, was not in agreement with certain Hubbard things, and he realized Ken Urquhart was not going to be a molded puppet. So he moved away from Urquhart, his personal communicator, and relied more and more on the messengers, who were young kids, 12 years old, 30, they would do anything. If he said, take off your shoe and hurl it at someone, they would do it. They were kids, 13, 14-year-olds. So he transitioned more and more leaning on the messengers. Charismatic, well, he had a huge presence. When you were with him, he was not daydreaming or thinking of anything else. He was focused on you. And he had a kind of high affection that he radiated, an affinity. And people found this irresistible. It was nothing to do with sexual. It was just intense interest in who you were and so on. And I think that the charismatic definition that people give, well, many big shots in the world have been described as charismatic, no matter what they no matter what they did. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Charm is one of the characteristics of the psychopath. The ability to make somebody feel loved and welcome, and to the way that they will apologize to be forgiven and then immediately do the same thing again. And if you look at it, the sociologist Max Weber is often cited on the subject of charisma by people looking at authoritarian groups, because he pretty much put forward the idea that charisma is something you give to people rather than something they broadcast. And I do tend to differ on that. I think there are people, I think Hubbard faked it. I don't think he actually liked anybody, given his reaction when Quentin died, his own son. I don't think he really loved anybody, given that the way that he pushed Mary Sue away after she'd gone to prison to save him. I don't think he felt affection, but he knew how to pretend it. He knew how to act and get people to believe what he was doing.
I do believe that he did believe in his work. I don't think...
I do as well.
Yeah, he actually believed. One thing about Howard was he was predictably repeatable. In other words, certain things set him off, and the messengers knew exactly certain things would trigger. You could predict his raw and his slamming. I had to laugh when I read my SP declare. I should really publish it on the internet. It's both Marty and Mike Rinder found it so boring. They said, Karen, it's not worthy of a blog. There's nothing there. Absolutely nothing. It was a boring thing. Oh, she upset people. She yelled. I thought, my God.
How scary being yelled at by Karen De La Carriere.
I said, oh my God, this person was not on the ship with Hubbard. Hubbard was the personification of a screamer. A scream. He had a screamer identity, because screaming and bellowing to the point where the ship's rafters could shake with such he had a lot of strength, a lot of tenor in his voice, a lot of resonance. And they're putting in an SP declare, one of my main crimes was I created turbulence because I yelled. Oh, oh boy. Anyway, so go ahead. So you said a charismatic leader has charm. What was the point there?
Well, something that I've observed is that if you look at, say, Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, which has sold so many millions of copies over the years, when I looked at it, it seemed to me that it was an empathetic person, and I think Dale Carnegie was an empathetic person, who was describing empathy. And the problem is that if you need to read that book, you don't have empathy. So it's a very good tool for people who are sociopathic or predators to learn how to mimic an empathetic behavior. And that's what I see. I mean, I remember interviewing John McMaster, the world's first real clear, as Hubbard called him. And he was he was surprised when he came to know Hubbard closely and spend time around him, which from 65 to what, about 1971 or something, 70, he spent quite a lot of time with Hubbard. And he was surprised that he had a public persona and a private persona. And they were so different that in private, he would find Hubbard crying. He would find Hubbard saying that he'd failed, that it didn't work. And yet in public, he had this bonhomie, he could put forward this personality. And that makes me think about, I think it's in the Data series, where he says that all you have to do is assume the beingness of something. And he talks about being the station manager of a railway station, that when all you have to do is assume the beingness and bully people. And I must admit that when I was in Scientology, I kind of went, so all you'd have to do is assume the beingness of a philosopher and a great psychologist. You wouldn't have to do any work. And it seemed to me that Ron Hubbard did a lot more assuming the beingness than actually understanding things deeply. And he was trying, I remember when I first met Jerry Armstrong in 1984, and he put forward this point, he said Hubbard was trying to cure himself. And that when I then went through the claims of cure in Dianetics of Modern Science of Mental Health, they were all things that Hubbard had a problem with. So it's got short-sightedness, but not long-sightedness, for example. It's got bursitis, which I'd never heard of, the between a muscle and a bone, the lubricating. And he had bursitis in his shoulder. It's got asthma. And of course, he and David Miscavige, both asthmatics. And looking at the list later on, it was sort of, this is about him. When he talked about terror stomach, he was somebody who had purportedly had ulcers, though they were never found on X-ray, according to the Navy records. But he had indigestion all of the time. And it's sort of, then the depth with which he did things, that if I'm looking into something, I want to know who the experts are on that subject. Hubbard seemed to be more the kind of, what does the Reader's Digest say, or what does this magazine say? He didn't seem to research anything in serious depth. When I looked at Rees and Trout, Positioning the Battle for Your Mind, the book, which the marketing series is meant to come out of. It's one of the first things I read in Scientology at age 19. And because he'd said, this is the book, I went and read the book. And he'd misunderstood the book. He quite evidently didn't understand what positioning meant. And that made me think that he was maybe not taking enough time to understand things. And as I've come away, there's a superfice. He is a man who is pretending to be a war hero, pretending to have studied with gurus, pretending to be a nuclear physicist, and maintaining that pretense. He's also a man who's pretending compassion for humanity, in that he doesn't really, as I said before, he doesn't really seem to have liked anybody. Even when he was at St. Hill and he'd be going on about Red Sharp, my dear friend Red Sharp, that lasted about 3 years. And Reg was still there. When I left in 1982, he was still living on St. Hill Green. And when asked, why don't you move away? It must be so traumatic. He said, well, I'm waiting for them to move away. I'm afraid that they're still there and Reg isn't. But he didn't seem to keep friends. He didn't seem to be able to maintain relationships.
That's true.
And I think that's because people saw behind the public face and lifted up the peak of the cap and saw that there was a great big lump underneath, the sebaceous cyst, which he didn't dare have lanced because he was scared. He was scared of doctors. He didn't have his teeth done because he was scared of dentists. And yet there's the pretense of this incredibly brave, heroic character, who actually put on costumes to become the Commodore, to become the artist, to become the musician. It's fakery. That's my view of him.
Hubbard he really tested my power to forgive on the way he treated David Mayo. David Mayo was the hero of mine this lifetime. And David Mayo saved his life. And the way he allowed that issue, the story of a squirrel, to come out on David Mayo, and the way he went up, he absolutely knew everything RTC and OSA would do to just, this was arguably his best friend. He made Mayo the head of all of technology. Yep. And so it's true, even his best friends were often slaughtered, just completely Yeah. The other thing about Hubbard was he was obsessed with psychiatry and slamming psychiatry and bad naming psychiatry. There's a system within Scientology's computer area called Incom, and they have a program where you can put in one word. If you put in the word psychiatry, and the system will pull up, I think it's called SIR, Search Information Retrieval.
Yeah.
Search Information Retrieval.
Yeah.
Put in the word psychiatry, and every word Hubbard ever said on psychiatry, whether in green volumes or red volumes or flag, would get, page after page would be pulled. So you could see it with one click of a mouse, every reference on it. And I did that for fun when I worked at OSA. I looked up through 8 hours a day how many hits on psychiatry. And I thought, wow, this is huh?
He's obsessed
with psychiatry. And in L10, there's a huge amount of L10, which is simply sec checks. Now, remember that sec checks were still a relative novelty in 1970. By the time it hit the 80s, well, people were so overrun on sec checks. They would, if they knew that, they probably wouldn't even go back to flag if they knew they were going through having to pay for OSA interrogatories on them and their friends on sec check questions.
The sec check or security check, the confessional, later called integrity processing, whereby you are telling all of your dirty secrets to Scientology so they can be written down in a folder, and you're paying to have this done. I mean, the CIA should have sorted out how to do this. It'd be a very profitable organization. They could get people to pay for it. And as you say, it was introduced in 1959, I think, initially, because L. Ron Hubbard's son, after 7 years of being the deputy, had left, and he would become a serious target for his father, a father trying to destroy his son. And then when the Johannesburg organization, I think in 1963, they splintered, most of them left, and Hubbard decided this must be because of their terrible crimes against him, or he maybe realized that by saying that people only leave somewhere because they've done something criminal, they've committed what he called an overt, that you could persuade the followers that that was why people left. And it's used in so many authoritarian groups, this idea of, I daren't talk to former members because they have diabolic powers. They might do something dreadful to me, so I'm afraid of them. And that, the Jehovah's Witnesses call it shunning. You find it throughout the fringe religions. Yeah, it's this sense that anybody that's left has diabolical powers suddenly. I mean, the reactions to me when I left, and I'm I hope a fairly courteous and mild-mannered human being. I certainly don't shout very often. But the reactions that I've had from Scientologists, the terror of me, because of this idea that you have some sort of power, but also that you must have committed evil. You must be somebody who's really, horrible. Yeah. And building that into people by using security checking with these ludicrous questions, have you ever blanketed bodies for sexual thrills? Have you ever smuggled diamonds? Have you ever farmed babies? Which was these things that were specific to the sort of things that people would do who were against Scientology. Have you ever had a bad thought about L. Ron Hubbard? I mean, I'd probably be in a bit of trouble now with that one. That might take a few hours of checking, but or about Mary Sue Hubbard, that used to be. I think she's probably been taken off the list now. But as you say, that's just segueing into the development of the so-called list processes. And you were one of there are 50 people in total who are ever qualified to use these processes, list 10, list 11, and list 12. And you were talking about the way that security checking it becomes part of list 10. And I'm sure that
Very, very high dollar for these L's. Currently costs $100,000 for the 3 L's. When I was with Hubbard on the ship, it was $2,500 per L. So you had all 3 L's for $7,500. Boom. It's now $100,000. $100,000.
Yeah.
On L10, it has long lists basically asking for transgressions. Remember, there was no false purpose rundown. There wasn't all these advanced security.
The truth rundown, yeah.
Yeah. So, and some of the questions, you should see the look on the PC's face when you ask this. Like, did you ever psychiatrically twist somebody's mind? Now, this is from Hubbard's case.
Yeah.
These people sitting there were not mind control implanters, but there's a series of questions on L10 of, did you zap someone and indoctrinate them with false thoughts? And people look at you blankly. They're supposed to FN the question. You talked about the Joburg, the famous interrogatory Joburg. I had that same Joburg 13 times. 13 times. I had to sit through 165 questions. And the thing is, you have to have the needle float. But by now you're so angry that the needle could be stuck. You're not only angry, you're protesting all the way. Or you get away with it with the ARC brake needle, which floats. The ARC brake needle is a floating needle. So, contrary to what a floating needle is. Anyway, yeah, anti-psychiatry. Every year, a bunch of CCHR vigilantes would rent a plane and fly it over the annual psychiatric conference of psychiatrists with a banner saying psychiatry kills. And sometimes these doctors would come out and look at it, and there it would be circling hour after hour. They knew it was Scientology. So it was obsession, John. You should use the right word.
There's a very strange mentality, which I met in people who'd come out, who would come to me and say, oh, I can show you how to harass Scientology. There was a guy called Brian Wordy, who's one of the famous Scientology families. And he came to me the end of 1983, not long after I'd left. And he said, I used to be in branch 1 in London, and I can help you harass Scientology. And I just looked at him and said, that's why I left, because I found out that I belonged to a group that harassed people. And then this idea of that ruining somebody's life is somehow amusing. It's somehow, that you deserve to be attacked if you ask for dialogue, which was all I ever did. I only pointed to what Hubbard himself had said. My main informant in writing Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, fully half of the book is what Hubbard himself said. He's the guy who's explaining, the dirty tricks and the nasty things he's going to do to people, and who indeed wrote the manuals, like the Hubbard Communications Office Manual of Justice, which is says very little about justice. It says a great deal about a spoiled child who wants to get his revenge on the children who didn't like him, which is about how I see Hubbard.
In addition to what we do see, in addition to all that, there's the OSA network orders, all recorded with Hubbard's hand, previously known as the Guardian
orders. Yeah.
Guardian orders. And these are where the vengeance of Hubbard, the absolute bloodthirsty part of Hubbard, to even the score, are written up. That's why OSA carry on the way they do. That's why they maliciously they're not even ashamed. The internet is alive when you put in the word Scientology. If you put in Scientology Fair Game on YouTube, you'd get site after site after site. But you know why they cannot back off? You know why they don't change? Hubbard wrote in 1965, Keeping Scientology Working, where he put in the deep freeze everything he ever wrote could not be altered, could not be changed, could not be modified, could not be edited, could not be watered down, no matter what.
Even if he contradicted himself, everything he said was true. And you couldn't, safeguarding technology, technical degrades, these policy letters, you couldn't say this is the earlier, so this is the more recent one, so this will be more true. If there was any conflict, you were stuck. And it is a fantastic way of stopping people from thinking. And I believe he said that somewhere, but I've never been able to find the reference again. I thought it was false data stripping, that you basically put up two opposing ideas and somebody won't be able to think anymore. And in Scientology, it happens so often. You know, somebody asks for a refund, you always give them a refund. Somebody asks for a refund, you never give them a refund. Both of these things are sad. Some idiot has said that you should only indicate a floating needle if it is between 2 and 3.5 on the tone arm. He was that idiot. The bulletin where he says that is actually nestles next to the one where he calls the person an idiot for having said it. And those double binds hold people in. So when I found out that he had a filthy temper, I think it's okay to say it these many years later, my great friend Ira Chalef worked for me briefly in an artist agency I was running in 1982 in East Grinstead. And one day he screamed his head off at my wife. Oh, she wasn't my wife, then she would become my wife. And because she hadn't sold anything for a week. And he called her a suppressive and told her that she was trying to ruin my life and all this. And I hovered outside the door, kind of going, you know, this is a Hubbard aide. This is somebody who worked very closely with Hubbard. What on earth is he doing? And so when I got to sit down with him, which was a few days later, I said, where is it written that you do this? And Ira put his head in his hands and started crying. And he said, it's not written anywhere. And I said, well, if it isn't written, it isn't true, because that's what Hubbard said. You know, I parroted that. And he looked at him, and so I said, where did you get this from? He said, Hubbard did it to us. And that was a very significant moment for me, because my view of Hubbard was as somebody who was seeking to be a Buddha, somebody who had learned to release, you know, emotion, who would not be caught up in these things. And then I talked with Harvey Haber about the tech films and how terrified all the crew were of this screaming maniac. You know, if he when he went to sit down one day and the messenger wasn't there with the chair behind him, and so that messenger then did, you know, probably 2 years in the Gulag on the rehabilitation project force. I found out that he was a furious man, and at that point, my belief started to slip, because I have no respect whatsoever for people who rage and lose their temper. You know, I have no respect for myself if I lose my temper, let alone anybody else. So finding that out, I mean, Peter Warren, the first time I met Peter Warren, he told this story about the day he arrived at the flagship, and he'd done something that upset somebody. So they put him over the side of the ship on a plank with 2 ropes to paint the side of the ship. And it got dark and he's standing there, and he's never met Hubbard. And he suddenly hears this voice above, and it's Hubbard saying, you know, what are you doing down there? And he said, oh, I did something wrong. I'm painting the side of the ship. And I'm waiting. I'm sat in the audience at this talk, waiting for him to say, well, Hubbard say, he hasn't got a security harness on. What are you doing? You know, pull him back up. What a stupid thing to do. And instead, Hubbard says, put the lights on so he can see what he's painting. It's like, there you go. He's, you know, he really doesn't like people. And I think if you're going to found a religion that's going to save the world, the first step is you have to like people. You know, you have to want to save them.
Well, kindness, forgiveness, benign, loving kindness is not part of Scientology at all.
There is no compassion in Scientology.
There is no compassion. There's no such thing as making a mistake in Scientology. There are no errors in Scientology. There is only willful, evil purposes to destroy Scientology, that you would have made that silly error. You didn't do it happenstance. You did it because in some part of your spiritual universe, you want to harm Scientology.
You have evil purposes.
Evil purposes.
And it comes down to this thing that he said about intention and counter-intention and other intention. And I can remember many years ago, suddenly realizing that we in Scientology had an intention. My intention was to help people, to make the world a better place, to ameliorate. His intention was quite different. As L. Ron Hubbard Jr., Nibs said, Scientology works, but not as my father says it works, as my father intends it to work. And he intended it to enslave us. He intended it to make followers who would worship him. And he was successful.
Yeah. Oh boy, I wanted to tell you that you are not allowed to criticize or even query something Hubbard has written, because if you do, the retort is, what do your materials state?
Yeah.
Because no verbal discussion is permitted. See, you talked about the contrariness of Scientology. There's a great friend of mine on the board, ex-Scientology message board, and he talks about the Hubbard law of commotion, which he says for every single Hubbard doctrine, he can find a completely opposing, contrary action or doctrine. For example, Scientology in its glorious fashion says, man has an inalienable right to the creation of his own kind, meaning you cannot take away the right of a person to be a parent. Inalienable means you cannot take it away. Yet abortions were wholesale for 25, 30 years and are still done, mandatory, but done under the very light, very, very secretively. A recent blow mentioned, they're still enforcing, coercing abortion. So what Hubbard said, he writes the policy, what is greatness? Forgive your enemy. And then he writes the fair game of the guardian officer. Right.
Let's look at what is greatness, because it's written in March 1966. And if you go back 2 weeks before that, there are a series of policy letters called Attacks on Scientology are issued. There are 4 policy letters. The first, I think, on February the 14th, the last on the 18th. One of them is broad public issue. Everybody can see it. And it says, advocate total freedom. That's all you do. Then layer by layer, you get underneath until you've got the find out who is attacking us and find or manufacture enough threat to stop them. And at the same, within a couple of weeks, we've got what is greatness. And this is where we see, this to me is the significant aspect of Scientology. Hubbard always talks about there being, it's a 2-terminal universe. Everything for him is positive and negative. Now, the rest of us can see there as a spectrum. There are many shades of gray. There are also many different colors and hues. In fact, the human eye can recognize 80,000 colors and hues. He only recognizes black and white. That's all you've got, positive and negative. And the whole of Scientology is built on that. All of the goals, problems, masses of the reactive mind are positive, negative, to be, not to be, what have you, that are implanted. And he uses this technique and he builds upon it and sees the world in this way. And of course, he gets the Scientologists to see the world in this way. So that in the end, there is right and wrong. If you go to the back of Science of Survival, his second book in 1951, which was actually put together by Richard DeMille, but from Hubbard's notes, he lifts something from Count Alfred Korzybski, the founder of General Semantics, which is you've got the will of God, which is single valued logic. You've got right and wrong, which is dual valued logic. And then you've got infinity valued logic. I never saw any infinity valued logic in Scientology. I saw the will of Ron, and that was it. So if you disagree with him, then, you know, you're not self-determined anymore. You know, if you disagree with Ron Hubbard, then you're wrong. And yet by doing Scientology, you will become ever more self-determined, ever more capable of agreeing with Ron Hubbard, who happened to be wrong, by the way.
You know, it's not black and white. I'm glad you said this, because cults very much think in terms of black and white.
Polarization.
In reality, there are a million shades of gray in almost anything. I think I told you in an earlier video how David Miscavige stood on the stage, all his perfectly coiffed hair and his perfectly coiffed suit, and he said, "You are either with us or against us. You're not allowed to be on the fence, or you're not allowed to think about it or investigate." Black and white means you're 100% this way or 100% that way. That in itself is very misleading.
Yes, entirely.
A million shades of gray in everything, and good and bad in a lot of things. The thing is the percentage of bad far worse than the percentage of good.
And then you look to Hubbard himself, and he, in an axiom, says goodness and badness, beautifulness and ugliness are alike considerations and have no other basis than opinion. So he denies the reality of good and evil, which is a very dangerous place to go, as Adolf Hitler proved by taking the works of Friedrich Nietzsche and saying, beyond good and evil, as Nietzsche called it. So Hubbard has those contradictions, and they just never end. And they trap you, because if you think that he is wiser than you are, then you just go along with what he says. And that's pure authoritarianism. What we want is a society where people can think for themselves, make decisions and speak their opinions. And that's what we thought we were buying in Scientology. But we were buying the very opposite. That's the two-terminal thing, that on the one hand, he's saying, advocate total freedom. Everything will be fine. And on the other hand, he's saying, go and nail my enemies. In Ron's Journal 1967, that the contradiction is just incredible there, that he's saying, when the dogs are yapping at the wheels of the fire engine, you just ignore them. You go to the fire and put the fire out. In the same talk, he says Mary Sue, his wife, has hired professional intelligence agents, not private detectives, spies, to research the past of the British Prime Minister Harold Wilson and one of the press barons who's criticized him. So in the same place, you've got this double bind. And I found that that's often the case, and it stops us from thinking. For some reason, the human mind has problems with these contradictions. So you go, I'll just trust Ron. I'll just do what Ron says, rather than going, this guy's not trustworthy, which was my ultimate realization, that he couldn't be trusted. And if he couldn't be trusted, nothing of his technology could be trusted. So you have the independents out there who are saying, yeah, we know he was a rascal and a scoundrel and a liar, but we're going to become operating thetans. We're going to be exterior from our bodies. We're going to have superpowers, because this liar told us that if we gave him a lot of money, we would have. Do you have them yet? No. How many years have you been trying to get them? I've been doing this for 40 years, and you still don't have the superpowers that he promised. There's something very wrong in this picture,
A moment ago, we talked about Hubbard's law of commotion. For everything he ever said,
there is an equal and opposite reaction.
That you just used is a real buzzword. They've done they do lots of surveys, and they found out that freedom was a real, if they could pitch freedom, people would fork over cash. Freedom from the bank, freedom from your compulsions, freedom from collaboration, meaning
freedom from sales pitches.
Yes, freedom. The word freedom is almost limitless. It's quite a word. And yet in Scientology, day by day, the longer you're in, the more you're trapped, whether you're staff or public. Who you can talk to, who you cannot talk to, who you can socialize with, who you can even like. You can't give a like on Facebook. That is controlled by the hierarchy and big brother of the management of Scientology. You're more and more trapped. you're forced to come in for interrogatories. You're ordered, HCO, or you are hereby ordered. There's no freedom in that. You have no power of choice. And then you're threatened with an SP declare. So this pitching you, come to Scientology, will free you and give you more freedom, is a 180-degree backflip. You get more and more trapped.
In 1992, I published this booklet, which is called The Total Freedom Trap. And it starts, I don't particularly advocate it anymore because I've written a thing called Scientology's Cult of Greed, which is for people who've not been involved. But I use two quotations at the beginning of it. Scientology is a religious philosophy in its highest meaning as it brings man to total freedom. Ron Hubbard, Religious Philosophy and Religious Practice, 21st of June, 1960. An endless freedom from is a perfect trap, a fear of all things. Fixed on too many barriers, man yearns to be free, but launched into total freedom, he is purposeless and miserable. Ron Hubbard, The Reason Why, 15th May, 1956. So these, again, this contradiction runs along. It could also be said, and it has been said, that liberty, equality, fraternity, the French revolutionary slogan, which comes from the author Rousseau, who was a very strange man. But this idea of liberty, this is the freedom. But what do we want to be free from? We want to be free from crime. We want to be free from disease. Do we want to be free from happiness? Do you want to be free from health? And so exactly as you say, it becomes a thought-terminating cliche, is what Robert J. Lifton calls it, an idea that you can't think beyond. And I think I had a wonderful communication from the Scientology kids, ex-Scientology kids, people who've got together, who grew up within Scientology. And I'd said something about these slogans that are used to stop thinking and that are used to criticize members. And they put up a thing and asked people to write in and say, what are the things that these kind of punishment phrases that are used in Scientology? And I think the list had more than 350, get your stats up, you're a degraded being, all of these ways of stopping somebody from thinking and making them, belittling people, making them feel small.
Yeah, the Hubbard law of commotion. For everything you ever read in Scientology, you will find something diagonally opposed, 100%.
Diametrically, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And people believe, John, they give their life's work, their life's earnings, not only empty out everything they have in the bank, but give out future money that they're going to earn by going back to work and work hard on credit cards, money they don't even possess, but they're going to be getting in that money. It's already belongs to Scientology, who never, ever reveal that they're sitting in the back room with $3 billion cash.
Yeah.
Which they beg of you to take out a second trustee.
Yeah, and they're not going to use those funds for the good of humanity. They're going to use them so that David Miscavige can drink, Blue Mountain coffee and distilled water,
and pay their lawyers and private investigators to firewall and protect them from criminal charges. The bills they have for lawyers is astronomical. It's multi-million dollars a year.
Well, the two guys that the agency that were watching Pat Broker, they watched him for, I think it was 24 years, Tony Ortega found out, and the bill was $11 million to watch them. I was told in 1993 by the head of investigation in the UK that she was aware that £2 million had been spent in the 10 years up to, 9 years up to then, harassing me. To no effect at that time. They got there in the end, but the bills, I believe, for the time suit alone were $20 million, and to achieve what? What they've largely been doing is buying buildings around the world so that when the next property crash happens, they'll lose most of their money because, and it will happen because it happens every sort of 20 or 30 years. It is that essential thing. I remember talking with Otto Rose, who was a good friend of mine years ago. Sadly, I haven't heard from him for a long time, but he still really absolutely believed in it all. Of course, I don't believe in any of it. I think it's a nonsense. If anything good that Hubbard said he stole from somewhere else, and I've written a paper called Possible Origins for Dianetics in Scientology to show where he stole it from. So I look, as he says, you look at the original source of an idea if you want to understand it. And he's not the original source of any of the few good ideas in Scientology. But Otto still really believed in it all. But he agreed with me when I said there is no compassion in Scientology. He said, and that is its failure. That how can you create a system that's meant to be based upon communication and affinity when you have no affinity? When what you actually care about is controlling people. And it is that people, yes, they borrow. I talked with a guy who'd borrowed, I think it was £35,000 towards a new building. And he was told that he would have a parking space for all eternity, So it's not bad, considering how expensive parking can be, And he was now out of Scientology. And I was saying, well, you can get your money back. And he was, I'm scared, I don't want to try and do that. And so he was working 2 jobs so that he could pay off the money he'd borrowed to pay for a parking space for all eternity. And my heart just goes out to him. He was a lovely man and he'd been scammed. He'd been dragged in this thing. But there is something a lot worse than that. In 1993, I was asked by Lawrence Wollersheim and Bob Penny at FactNet. I became briefly the president of FactNet, the Fight Against Coercive Tactics Network, the first database on coercive psychology made available to the public in the history of humanity. And Bob did an incredible job. He was a remarkable man. Lawrence promoted it, was quite brilliant. But they said, what's the suicide rate in Scientology? And I spent a few months, I investigated 38 cases. And I then looked at the real membership of Scientology, which at that time was probably about 40,000. I mean, we've got statistics from the inside, which show about 25,000, about 3 years ago. And back in the 80s, it was about 25,000 at its peak. After Jeff Hawkins had done the Dianetics campaign, it was perhaps 40,000. And the suicide rate in Scientology, when compared with national rates in the US and the UK, was about 10 times the normal rate. So that's the worst thing, that it drives people to death because it doesn't work. And it then persuades people that they're wrong, that the reason it didn't work was because they didn't apply it properly. And,
I think people, messengers and other people say Hubbard tended to go dark after that very bad motorcycle accident he had when we were on the islands in the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
But I will tell you, I did that Class 8 course more than once and listened to the tapes more than once. In 1968, when Hubbard ordered people thrown overboard every day.
And took photographs of it and published them in Auditor number 41. So there's no doubt it happened.
But for a minor error.
You were 5 minutes late.
4 stories down. That's how high you were thrown from promenade deck, and it's equivalent to in a building 4 stories, and you were plunged into water is always cold, but there would be feces drain off from different ships. This wasn't pure swimming pool chlorinated water. This was oceanic. And in 1968, he had already gone dark. Now, if you really listen to those Class 8 tapes, I have all the transcripts. People keep sending me this kind of stuff. Hubbard changed he was nothing like the Hubbard of the 1950s. The theme in the Class 8 tapes of 1968 was, we own this planet. The planet is here to obey us.
Let's make friends with the biggest enemies of the West, as he says in the Guardian's order of that time.
He now took on a role of, I will crack a whip if you disobey. And some of these pronouncements are quite blood-curdling. It's like, and when I listen to them 20, 30 years later, after coming out of the mindset, it was like Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. I shattered because I got nuances and I got the enlightenment of no longer looking through a tunnel, but actually seeing where Hubbard was going. He did want Scientology to take over the planet. He had political motives.
Yes.
There was no longer some genteel thing to help people get better. This is 1968. And earlier in this show, I talked about how Hubbard was repeatedly predictable. Well, that's not really true because he gradually did worsen. He got more and more tough at in-base. He was just absolutely paranoid about his own Sea Org members who had got very high clearance to even be at the base. And there was more and more punishment, more and more. You couldn't go home to sleep in your own bed. You were to sleep out in the fields. I mean, you couldn't eat the normal food. You would eat leftover stuff. It was just punishment, 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 abuse, abuse, abuse. And to this day, the word Scientology is synonymous with abuse.
Yes.
Abuse, domination, control, authoritarian. These now, the word Scientology on the internet is synonymous with their darkness. And I'm very happy to be able to meet with you once a month, whenever it is, just to re-emphasize. So people, lurkers who watch all this, and maybe have a family member getting lured in, please learn Scientology in the main, even if they give you a little huff and puff and a little win and a little happiness transitory, a day or two of feeling bright, you pay the price in blood.
Absolutely.
And I talk from being a true believer for 40 years. I didn't get into Scientology because one day I was going to speak. I wanted it to work.
Oh yeah.
I wanted to believe it.
And you gave everything to it.
To be a winner. 20 years I slaved. Before the Sea Org, I slaved for them at St. Hill, being their power auditor. I mean, if you count how many years, I was 20 years full-time feeding the drum for Scientology survival.
No.
And what I got was the loss of my 27-year-old son due to Scientology vengeance, cutting him off from me. So he had no medical and he died. And a bunch of hate pages with preposterous things.
Well, they spew.
Which incite me to make more videos and more revelations. Anyway, Jon, I just always enjoy it. You truly say so much in one sentence. I even learned, I thought I knew everything, but even now, I learned from you.
Wonderful. Well, likewise.
Wonderful to see you again, Jon.
Let me round up with a quotation from Ron Hubbard. And this is from 1967, so the founding of the Sea Organization. If anyone is getting industrious trying to interbulate or upset or stop Scientology or its activities, I can make Captain Bligh look like a Sunday school teacher. There is probably no limit on what I would do to safeguard man's only road to freedom against persons who, disdaining Scientology processing, seek to stop Scientology or hurt Scientologists. I've got an earlier handwritten one this is again is this little booklet. Sell this, The Cult of
Is
Greed.
that the one where folks he bashed the teeth in
Yeah,
his
this is
handwriting?
where he says, I will beat their teeth
Read
in
that.
personally, signed L. Ron Hubbard. So that viciousness is, especially when he's saying, you know, I mean exactly what I say. You must do exactly what I say, in his kind of safeguarding technology, technical degrades, keeping Scientology working, all of these things. And then you go to the responsibilities of leaders, the Simon Bolivar policy, where he's basically saying, well, the leader doesn't need to know everything. You know, he's got to have lots of blackmail material, but if you need to do something nasty on his behalf, this is evil. And it's not making people superhuman. It's not making people good, moral, kind, compassionate, and decent. This is an awful scheming con man who is entrapping people into his web. So that, and I'm pretty sure of this now, that his intention was to be revered as a god, which I said in Blue Sky in 1990. It was very funny because Marty Rathbun had this revelation on his blog a few years ago that, oh, Hubbard was trying to be a god. And I just wrote to him and said, read this book published in 1990. Please read it, you know, please actually see that somebody has actually trod this road to total freedom from Scientology before, you know, and it might be helpful. But still, he was a bad man. And we've hopefully done something to enlighten people about that, and maybe help some people not get involved with it, and help some other people to disentangle the control that he's put into their minds with this terrible, terrible system. And as ever, it has been a tremendous privilege and a tremendous pleasure talking with you, Karen. And we'll meet again in a few weeks' time.
Yeah, John, you know, there's an insider leaking to Tony Ortega. Have you read those insider?
I don't really read anything that's to do with Scientology anymore. I use it to exemplify authoritarianism.
Scientology is falling apart inside. These are very important leaks.
These are the last days. Yeah.
And
I'll go and have a look.
They're worth a read. The last 10 days, there are 3 posts, and they're from the inside, and they're amazing, amazing. Okay. But everything that we have hoped and dreamed about, it can't exist in its current form. No. How can it doesn't, it cannot prevail. Anyway, John, it's lovely meeting with you. My final words is this: if you would like John and I to answer any questions, if you've had like, we don't know if we're missing about like something you've been wanting to know, or you need clarification on, or you have a little story to tell us and you want it amplified to ask, do they do this all the time, or is this unique? Anything at all. Put your questions in the comments, or write to John, write to me, and we will be happy to take up what's on your mind. Thank you, and bye-bye. Happy New Year, everyone.
And if you want to tell your story, go on to I Got Out, hashtag I Got Out, and tell your story there, because people need to know about. This is the Me Too movement for ex-members.
You're welcome. Yeah.
Oh, yes. Happy New Year, everybody.
John, love to you. Huggies.
To you as well. Yeah.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.